What's going on, everybody? This is Afro Think Tank. Today's video is going to be a lesson in history. It's important for African people, especially right now in the age of information, to kind of catch up on, some information that should be, something that's just default in your head. And the thing is, a lot of us African Americans, not only are we miseducated on our own history, but we have absolutely no idea of the history of our ops, our opponents, our colonizer. We don't have any history. Most African Americans, most Africans don't know anything about European history. They just know the history starts when they came upon our shores and did what they did, right? But have you ever wondered what was happening just before the transatlantic slave trade? What was happening during the transatlantic slave trade? And what happened directly after the transatlantic slave trade? Because there's a lot of people that think that, Europeans were just, kumbaya, and they were just, enjoying the spoils of destroying the entire world. But I need you guys to understand, when it comes to death, destruction, and raping, Europeans are not racist. Not at all. They are equal opportunity. I will take your shit, all right? So I'm not gonna make this too long because I want you to watch the video. So without further ado, watch this, because it's important to know. Just like I had some people tell me that history is not important. I'm like, I know you're stupid, because history is the indication of the future, okay? So just like boxers, if you have an opponent, you have to study their film. You have to see how they fight, other styles. You have to see what are their bad habits, what are their tickers, what sets them off, what does it take? Because you need to understand the European. If you don't understand the European, you don't know what you're doing when you're going up against them, okay? We may, as African Americans, know the most about Europeans out of all African people, and I think South Africans also know more about the European than any other African. But between us South Africans and African Americans, we know intimately the European, okay? The South Africans knows the European when they're in their colonizing mode. African Americans, we know the European when they're slavery mode, but it was still colonizing mode because they were colonizing the Native Americans while enslaving us at the same time. But I just need you to pay attention. Europeans, man, it wasn't sweet. It was not sweet at all for the average European. And the average European has, for all intents and purposes, been just as big of victims as the rest of us. It's just that they don't know that they're just as big of victims as the rest of us. And you know what? Truth be told, this is gonna sound kind of controversial. They may actually have come out of this whole thing much worse than the rest of us. All right, I'm telling you. But anyway, without further ado, here we go.
What do you think is the most important European battle?
Battle of Varna, 1444.
Why?
Easy. Well, it's an easy answer because the Battle of Varna is the thing that set the Ottomans on their path to conquest, right? You're talking about, at that point, the Europeans, a lot of Eastern Europe at that time was united under one king. Like, what was it? Jagiellon? No, or it was the king who was like the ruler of Bohemia and Poland and all that. Like, he had all of it under his own control. He dies in that battle, completely sets everything in Eastern Europe just up for grabs for the Ottomans. And they spend the next 100 years at that point taking over Hungary, taking over Serbia, Wallachia, Moldova. They reach all the way to Vienna itself. If that battle had not gone the way that it did, if the Ottomans had lost, you would have seen a united Christian force go in through the Balkans and potentially wreck Constantinople and bring back some kind of Byzantine state.
Nice.
17th century Europe was witness to one of the longest and most brutal wars in human history. The conflict lasted for over a generation and was responsible for the deaths of up to half the population in some countries. When it finally ended, it resulted in a new geopolitical order, which, for the most part, still exists today. Learn more about the 30 Years' War, one of the bloodiest wars in world history, on this episode of Everything Everywhere Daily.
375 years ago, on October 24th, 1648, the 30 Years' War ended. When Ferdinand II became Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, he imposed Catholicism as the only religion, causing many of the Protestant nobles to rebel. Eventually, most of Europe was plunged into the war, with France, Sweden, and the Dutch Republic against the Catholic Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and Denmark-Norway. The Treaty of Westphalia ended the conflict, shifting the balance of power in favor of France. The Holy Roman States were given sovereignty, the Netherlands were granted independence, and Sweden took control of the Baltic. An estimated 12 million people died due to the war, making it one of the longest and most brutal wars in human history.
I see a lot of arguments between particularly Catholic and like Protestant only on TikTok because the type of people. Never. I'm not gonna finish my full thought on that because I'll lose my account. But anyway, have you ever heard of the European Wars of Religion? So, it's like on Wikipedia, it's gonna say 16th, 17th century. I like to say 15th, 16th, 17th century is kind of when this went down. Because the printing press was made, and then the Bible started being printed in the common vernacular language. And the Catholic powers that be, they didn't like that. And blah, blah, a lot of stuff happens. There's this guy named Jan Hus. Jan isn't really that big a fan of the Catholic Church. And he has some grievances. And the Catholic Church burns him alive. But basically, when Hus dies, after calling out the corruption of the papacy and the Catholic Church, and, you know, they burn him alive, a bunch of people that, like, supported him and kind of believed what he said, they're like, you know what, I don't like that. I really don't like that. And, so these people that would be called the Hussites, they basically go to war with the Holy Roman Empire and every Catholic that tries to tell them what to do. And at the head of that force, for a long time, never losing a battle, is Jan Žižka. But this isn't about Jan Žižka. I'll get there. That whole conflict ends, and, like, not really all that much changes, because within the Hussites, I believe after Žižka's death, they kind of have their own little civil war. And that would look like fucking small potatoes compared to, I don't know, the German Knights War. Or Revolt. Where a bunch of knights are kind of like losing their station because, like, knighthood is sort of starting to fall to the wayside. Because professional militaries are starting to take, particularly mercenaries at this point. So the knights don't like that and they revolt. Then, not long after that, you get the German Peasants' Revolt, wherein up to maybe 300,000 German people were slaughtered by, Catholic authorities. And then you get one of the big ones, probably the biggest, is the 30 Years' War. But it's like, they call it the European Wars of Religion, which absolutely there was some religious context to it. But basically, which is really interesting, very interesting, it was all about control. 100% about control. First, it was who controlled the information. Then, it was like, who do these people pay taxes to? And then, it kind of just boiled down to, we don't like the ideas that these people have. Believe it or not, it's a very, very common occurrence. Like, you just think, in the modern day, now with all the technology, that a government that's losing its grasp on the minds and ideas of its citizens, perhaps, maybe it might get a little violent. So the Black Death killed like a third of the people in Europe, allegedly. A third to a fifth of all people in Europe. And most of those people, just by happenstance, were peasants. So this left the remaining peasants with a whole bunch of bargaining power, because now their services were worth a whole lot more than what they had been before. Now, combine that with several advances in you'd call them advances in military technology, plus the arrival of gunpowder in Europe, and there are quite a few changes going on. Changes that are putting more of the power in the hands of the average person, which the powers that be don't like that much. One of these advancements is the printing press. And the printing press allows the Bible and some other things, to be printed in mass in their vernacular language, mostly German. And so these, people that didn't speak Latin because they weren't rich nobles, start reading the Bible for the first time, not having it read to them by Catholic priests. And several men who read the Bible, they start to speak out against the corruption of the Catholic Church. One of these men is Jan Hus. Jan Hus would speak out against the things that the Catholic Church has been doing. Then the Catholic Church would burn him alive. They'd tie him to a stake and they'd burn him alive. Well, there was this group of people led by Jan Žižka who didn't like that. And I've talked about Jan Žižka before in the Hussite Wars. That's not what this is about. Eventually, the Hussites would splinter and they'd start fighting themselves, and they'd become the Utrechists and the Taborites. And eventually they would both kind of submit to the Catholic Church. To make a long story short, this thing called the European Wars of Religion happened. Which, it's interesting that it's called the European Wars of Religion. Because while the broader context was Catholic versus Protestants, it was really more about the Catholic Church losing control on the masses should some sovereigns or some people no longer be Catholic. It was really about how much power the church had and how they didn't want others to have this power. Or, another kooky fun story, in Rome, there are these guys called the Gracchi brothers. And they would attempt to make some reforms in the Roman political system to, again, put power, mostly lands and food, in the hands of the common man. The powers that be didn't like that. Eventually, directly, that leads to the Marius and Sullan Civil War. And Sulla, as he is an optimate, I think, he sides with the politicians, with the senates, and he executes a bunch of, basically any human being that could have possibly been a threat to his rule, because he became dictator for 10 years, and he kind of stabilized Rome for a little bit, genuinely, but he had to off a lot of people to do it. Now, I know you think that I just rambled for like 3.5 minutes, but it just brings up a point. Eventually, the people will acquire too much knowledge or power. And eventually, the government will act out against its people. It's happened every single time throughout history. There is not a place that it hasn't. If you don't believe me, I suggest you read a book. But regardless, strap in.
I'm going to try to explain the French Wars of Religion in 60 seconds. France had been historically Catholic, but with the Protestant Reformation, you start to see the rise of Huguenots in France, and they are French Calvinists. There's some simmering religious tensions in France, and then the French king, Henri II, dies. 3 families start to fight for power. In the middle, you have Henri's widow, Catherine de' Medici. She's Catholic, and she represents the Valois family. You also have the emergence of some ultra-Catholics, called the Guise family. And then you have some Protestants in the Bourbon family. Valois want to stay in power. The Guise family is like, you're not Catholic enough, and then both of them are like, let's not ever let Protestants rule. A bunch of wars happened between all the families. In order to bring peace, Henry Bourbon agrees to marry Catherine de' Medici's daughter. During their wedding celebration, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre happens. Catholics were fearful that Protestants would take over the government, so 10,000 Huguenots were killed. Henri Bourbon, also Henri of Navarre, escapes by converting to Catholicism. War breaks out between the 3 families in the War of the 3 Henrys. Henri of Navarre wins. I didn't make it in 60 seconds. So after the St. Bartholomew Days massacre, Henri of Navarre had converted to Catholicism, but he had actually quickly renounced that. So when the war broke out between the 3 Henrys, he was Protestant again. He ends up winning that war and converts back to Catholicism again. Paris is worth a mass. This is a great example of politique, which is advocating for political stability over religious orthodoxy. He then also issues the Edict of Nantes. So I know my French pronunciation is bad, but I'm trying. The Edict of Nantes allows for religious pluralism to exist in France. Henri Bourbon, aka Henri of Navarre, aka Henri IV, says, hey, French Huguenots, you can still be Protestant. You just can't do it in the city of Paris. But this idea of religious pluralism starts to spread throughout all of Europe and brings us to the 30 Years' War.
Did you know that for around 67 years in the 14th century, the popes didn't rule from Rome? They actually ruled from a small town in the south of France known as Avignon. And this period of time is known to historians as the Avignon captivity, and it would have tremendous consequences for the Christian world, leading it in fact to splitting up in 2. So let's take a look at the history. You see, by the 14th century, France is at its apex during the Middle Ages, and it's led by this guy, Philip IV, who is described as being like a statue in that he shows no emotion and he is ruthless. And he has a wicked falling out with this fella, Pope Boniface, that actually leads to Philip of France sending troops to capture and kidnap Boniface, beat him up, and keep him in prison for 3 days. And after Boniface passes away, there's another pope, but he lasts about 5 minutes. So the next one is this fella, Clement V. And he is himself French, and he ends up falling under the thumb completely of the French king. And Clement spent most of his reign proving himself unbelievably loyal to Philip of France, including putting the now deceased Boniface on trial. Yes, a deceased pope was put on trial. And this shocked and scandalised the Christian world at the time, but Philip of France did not like this guy, and he wanted justice, no matter the consequences. And during all this, in the year 1309, Clement also pardons Philip and his French counterparts for the kidnapping of Boniface. Clement, 2 years prior, as well showed tremendous loyalty to the King of France. You see, the King of France owed tremendous amounts of money to the Knights Templars, and so he decided, I'm just going to get rid of them, I'm going to capture them, I'm going to imprison them, and I'm going to knock them off. Which, on October 31st, 1307, is exactly what Philip does. And Pope Clement supports him the whole way. And in 1309, he actually moves the court of the Pope from the Papal States to Avignon, a small town in the south of France that at the time doesn't have this magnificent palace. It's barely able to support the Pope and all his courtiers that have to come with him. But it's important to be close to the King of France. And for 67 years, the popes ruled from here. It caused tremendous strain of the city of Rome and in the papal church itself. Now, it wasn't necessarily uncommon for popes not to live in Rome. They constantly tried to escape the meddling and influential families that lived there, but it was uncommon for it to fall under such a strong influence from a secular monarch. However, in 1377, Pope Gregory XI returns the papacy to Rome. However, he passes away the following year, and so a papal election is called, where Pope Urban VI is elected. However, the French cardinals don't like this, so they have another election, where they elect the Frenchman Clement VII. So this means now there are two popes, one pope and one anti-pope, and depending on who you talk to, you don't know which is which. But it quite literally splits Christian Europe in two, the red supporting Avignon and the blue supporting Rome. And this split would go on for around 40 years, causing tremendous damage. I hope you enjoyed.
The 30 Years' War, Europe's most devastating religious conflict, began in 1618, when Czech Protestants threw some Catholic officials out a castle window in the Second Defenestration of Prague. Yep, second. It happened more than once. Let's count. The first defenestration happened in 1419, when a group of Hussites, a proto-Protestant group, was demonstrating outside town hall, where several of their members were held prisoner. Then, when someone threw a stone at their leader, they stormed the hall and threw the town's councillors from the windows, thus beginning the Hussite Wars. After that, defenestration became a symbol of rebellion, signifying the start of armed conflict. It happened again in 1483, when the king replaced several Hussite officials in Prague with Catholics, and a mob responded by murdering them and throwing their bodies from the town halls again. Though that one doesn't traditionally get a number, though, I guess because they're already dead? I don't know. Whether that makes sense or not, the point is Czech Protestants knew exactly what message they were sending when they threw those guys out the window in 1618. And to learn more of the devastating war that followed, click the link below.
The 30 Years' War lasted from 1618 to 1648. Its causes include tensions between Catholics and Protestants in the Holy Roman Empire, political rivalries between various states and rulers, and the normal struggle for power and territory that accompanies most wars. You can look up the 4 phases of the 30 Years' War if you want some periodization. It was mostly fought in Germany, Denmark, Sweden, France, and Spain. Here are your major players in the 30 Years' War: the Holy Roman Empire led by the Habsburgs, the spattering of various Protestant states, the Catholic League, which is a bunch of Catholic states, and then Denmark, Sweden, France, and Spain. What is the significance or takeaway of the 30 Years' War? It had a devastating impact on Europe's economy, society, and politics, like any war. It caused the decline of the Holy Roman Empire. France starts to emerge as a dominant European power, and it ends with the Treaty of Westphalia, which established principles of state sovereignty and sowed the seeds for religious.
The 30-Year War decimated Europe. Up to 25% of Europeans died during the war. It all started in a Prague castle when 3 Catholic officials were thrown from a window. The ensuing war started in 1618 and no one knew that this war would last 30 years and impact so many lives. This became known as total war. No longer were armies fighting combatants, but civilian populations were drawn into the strife. This was a war between the superpower Catholics against the upstart Protestants. Nobility fighting nobility. Who was caught between them? The hapless peasants. After 30 years of war, 25 million casualties, another 45 million displaced or otherwise affected, peace finally was restored on the continent of Europe, and the map was redrawn.
There came with the Russian Revolution a break in the fabric of international capitalist history. There now was a country where the unwashed, where the workers of Petrograd and Moscow were actually taking over, where they were actually taking over the land, the labor, the technology, and the resources of their country, where communists were coming in to power. And there's a remarkable correspondence between Secretary of State Lansing and President Woodrow Wilson, in which Lansing says, the Bolsheviks are wanting in political virtue. They would preach to the ordinary man that he might elevate himself through political means rather than by dint of hard work. This would be a most unfortunate example to the common man in our country and other countries. They understood what was the threat. The Americans themselves, the American ruling class, had very little didn't have all that much. I told you about Hoover and a few other speculators, other people like that. But they joined in with 14 other nations to invade the Soviet Union, to overthrow the socialist government that had just been put in after the Tsar was overthrown. That process of invading a revolutionary country is still happening before our eyes. If you want to understand those years after the Russian Revolution, just look at what's going on in Nicaragua. Invasion, either by directly with troops from your own country, or by using surrogate troops, and they use the white armies and the white generals, the white guard armies. Embargoes, isolation, withholding food supplies, sabotage, encirclement, refusing diplomatic recognition. These are the methods that are used, and these are the methods, time-honored methods that are being used right now by Reagan against another revolutionary government, which is Nicaragua.
Hi, my name's Will. I'm from the Marxist Student Federation and the International Marxist Tendency. So today marks the anniversary of the Russian Revolution, and for the first time in history, capitalism had been overthrown and for a period replaced by the most democratic regime the world has ever seen. This was the single greatest achievement of the working class in history and the most monumental event in modern history. This may seem like an overstatement, but I defy you to think of any historical moment in the last 100 years that wasn't in some way or another directly or indirectly influenced by the Russian Revolution. For example, US and Western domestic and foreign policy, specifically in relation to the Second World War, the Cold War, the wars in Vietnam, Afghanistan, the Contra Wars in Latin America and Asia, the Chinese, Cuban and the colonial revolutions, and then the subsequent effects that these had on the consciousness of the ruling classes and the workers and peasants all over the world. And the list goes on. The Russian Revolution was massive. It was undeniably the most influential event in history, and not only that, it was the most inspiring act of bravery and courage that shines like a beacon of hope to all the oppressed peoples of the world, that there is a way out of the endless suffering and misery. The revolution was the first time capitalism was overthrown. The huge, seemingly unbreakable worldwide machine that was capitalism and imperialism was smashed in Russia. The world capitalist class could only look on in horror as Lenin and Trotsky led the working class to victory. Therefore, as Marxists, we must study the Russian Revolution. We need to draw the lessons from the successes and the failures of the Bolshevik Party. And not only that, we must understand why the most progressive and democratic regime in history turned into its opposite, a bloated, ultra-conservative bureaucracy. Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Lenin understood this, which is why he set about the lifelong task of mastering the Marxist method and painstakingly training up the Bolshevik Party in revolutionary theory. They carefully studied the revolutions that came before them so that they could correctly orientate themselves and work out a path to lead the working class to victory. This was exactly how capitalism was overthrown in Russia, and it is our task heading into the crises that lie ahead. We must therefore prepare ourselves seriously by building on these traditions. So like Lenin and the Bolsheviks did, let's educate ourselves on the revolutions that came before us, and this starts with the Russian Revolution. So write into the MSF website where you can join one of our reading groups and arm yourself with the most powerful revolutionary weapon, the weapon of Marxist theory. So what are you waiting for? Join us in the struggle for socialism. We have a world to win.
היטלר טוען בספר שלו שהיהודים הם קומוניסטים. הם עשו את המהפכה ברוסיה. הם הרגו שם 30 מיליון רוסים, את כל האינטליגנציה, בצורה אכזרית ונוראה. ואת זה הם רוצים לעשות לכל העולם. הארץ הבאה בתור זה גרמניה. הם הקימו את המפלגה הקומוניסטית והסוציאליסטית הגרמנית, וזה נכון. אם אנחנו לא נתגבר עליהם עכשיו, הם יחסלו אותנו וישחטו גם כאן 20 מיליון איש את כל האינטליגנציה. וככה הם הלכו מארץ לארץ. כשבסופו של דבר האינטליגנטים היחידים, החכמים היחידים, יהיו רק היהודים. והוא חוזר על זה הרבה פעמים, שלא תהיה טעות. והוא צודק. את המהפכה ברוסיה עשו היהודים.